Okay, this is Barry Shaw from Israel. I'm the Senior Associate for Public Diplomacy at the Israel Institute of Strategic Studies. And today, I want to highlight a problem that is sweeping around Europe, and that is anti-Semitism linked to an anti-Zionist, anti-Israel agenda. And because of the program, because of you, Lawrence, I'm restricting what I'm going to say about things that are happening in Sweden that need to be addressed. And one of those, I say, the Coordination Forum for Countering Anti-Semitism focused on Sweden. And it seems to be that in the last few years, the focus of anti-Semitism in Sweden, although not totally confined without talking about the neo-Nazis, has been linked to the Israel-Palestinian conflict, which shows itself with anti-Semitic incidents in Sweden itself. In Sweden, the last report we had was between 50–54% of Swedish Jews have heard accusations that Israel behaved to Palestinians like the Nazis to the Jews. And Nazi stereotyping is there. It's applied to the Jewish state. It's a pernicious twist on an age-old hatred. Moshe Kantor of the European Jewish Congress accused the Swedish government of never having had a deep debate of what is at foot in anti-Semitism in Sweden today and the connection between the Jew hatred there and Israel hatred. And I think we need to produce just a couple of examples of where this takes place. To give you an idea, in December 2017, following a pro-Palestinian rally in Gothenburg, a dozen men threw firebombs at a synagogue and Jewish graves were desecrated. This is anti-Israel Jew hatred. In the same month, after President Trump announced his recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, a spontaneous demonstration in Malmo of 200 people took to the streets chanting, "We will shoot the Jews," not Israel, the Jews. And the following day, another crowd shouted, "Kaiba, Kaiba al-Yahud," meaning, Jews, remember, the army of Muhammad is coming to slaughter you. Again, a connection of anti-Israel Jew hatred. And what we have now in Sweden is what we call over here a red-green anti-Israel coalition. It's an alignment between the left and the Muslims in an anti-Israel offensive. One of the things making it more relevant and why I've asked Douglas to come on is give you one example of where, again, this anti-Israel Jew hatred takes place. Is we have been seeing recently, in several months, Swedish youth patrolling the streets of Hebron, believe it or not, provoking the Jewish residents, the police and security forces. They call Hebron a settlement. Hebron.
בלב חברון מצלמים, מתעדים את כוחות הביטחון. אני לא רוצה לצלם את החיילים, אבל תראו, כן, המצלמה שלה מכוונת לחיילי צה"ל. כולם ידעו מי האנשים שמצלמים את חיילי צה"ל, כולם ידעו מי האנשים שמחפשים פרובוקציות. תראו את הפרצופים האלה, אחרים תראו אותם אולי מסתובבים בתל אביב, בברים, בירושלים. חשוב מאוד לראות אותם, שהכל פה זה דימוי, הכל פה זה הצגה, הכל פה זה פרובוקציות מתוכננות מראש.
You're a tourist? You know that I call to the police because you don't need to do it.
You enter to Israel with the tourist visa?
You're a tourist? You enter to Israel with the tourist visa? Yes? Yes?
אתם יודעים שזה לא חוקי שהם מסתובבים פה תארים?
הם אסור להם ללבוש את האפודים האלו, אני התקשרתי למשטרה, אני מחכה שהיא תגיע. האירופאים. אפשר, הזמנתי להם משטרה.
היי, how you doing? היא לא בחנייה של can I shake your hand?
And land that became Hebron, and it's where the Jewish patriarchs and matriarchs are buried. So Israel, Hebron, is not a settlement. It is a metaphor for the anti-Israel, anti-Semitism to declare that Hebron, a city sacred to Jews, must be Judenrein, free of Jews. And having said that, and I have more to say about certain Swedish NGOs who receive an inordinate amount of funding that goes towards what they call human rights and civil rights, but it's in fact money which is spent to spread poison, anti-Israel propaganda, and anti-Israel activity. And based on that, I'd like to introduce onto the show Douglas Altabef, who is one of the main representatives of an organization in Israel called IDF. Douglas, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you, Barry. It's good to be with you. It's good to be here on behalf of IDF, the largest grassroots Zionist organization in Israel, which I have the privilege to serve as chairman of the board of. And IDF is well aware of the kind of organizations that you're speaking of, well aware not only of groups that are coming from Europe, but of tremendous amounts of foreign money that is being channeled to anti-Israeli NGOs. So in other words, groups that are operating here with very extensive funding from whether it's European governments, the EU, or various NGOs associated with European governments.
All right, Douglas, Gerald Steinberg, the executive director of NGO Monitor, that is an Israeli NGO which charts and records the misuse of European taxpayers' money going into propaganda and anti-Israel activities, said that Swedish government funds are being utilized by NGOs to fuel political attacks against Israel under the facade of human rights. What could you tell us about, for instance, IDF? What have you discovered with IDF about how European, in this case, let's say Swedish taxpayers' monies are being misused for propaganda and false allegations against Israel?
Well, we know that a great deal of European government money, whether it's coming from the EU, particular European governments, or NGOs, non-governmental organizations that have connections with European governments, are being used to heavily fund Israeli organizations that have a political agenda similar to that of these European governments. And what that agenda is to have Israel leave Judea and Samaria, Israel leave East Jerusalem, have the various security services that exist for us in those areas depart. And it's a very heavily funded effort. Preeminently organizations such as Breaking the Silence, or B'Tselem, or Abdallah, or Maxom Watch, or Hamoked get extensive funds from those governments.
Yeah, I can back that up, Douglas, by giving you one statistic here. NGO Monitor in June 2018 reported that 39 anti-Israel NGOs received, believe it or not, $150 million budgets funded by European mainly powers. And in Sweden, they received $10.5 million of this fund. And one of the main recipients is an organization in Sweden called Diakonia. An organization said it works for human rights for Palestinians and Israelis, that spends much of its money bringing charges against Israel, but none against the Palestinians, and does nothing about the human rights abuses being inflicted on Israeli citizens by Palestinian violence or terror, or even against the Palestinians by their own authority. And Diakonia gets a budget of over $6.5 million. say they're working for peace, but they distribute it to radical NGOs, ones that, for instance, that compares the Israeli military and political figures to Nazis, and actually said that President Shimon Peres, who received a Nobel Prize for Peace, is an enemy of human rights and of peace, and that working with the Peres Center for Peace is morally disgusting, their words. Have you come across anything like this with regard to the activities in Tirsu?
Well, sure. We confront this all the time. Look, the term human rights is a very selectively applied term. It's human rights when I say that it is, and when you say that it is, it's really just political. It's a very cynical application of the concept of human rights. In other words, it means that the Palestinians are victims, but human rights don't really apply to Israelis. And it's a very transparent fig leaf for intensely political ideological activity that may wrap itself in a mantle of human rights. But I think that through our efforts, certainly the people in Israel and more people throughout the world are coming to understand that organizations such as the anti-Israeli organizations, and certainly the European organizations, have zero interest in human rights per se, but it is the rights of certain humans, i.e. Palestinians, that they're really interested in and pushing a political agenda.
I want to ask you another question here. There's an organization called Youth Against Settlement, YAS organization. It's based in Hebron, and it sends representatives to Sweden to lecture in high schools against Hebron's Jewish residents. I mentioned this before. One high school student in Sweden who attended one of their lectures in February of 2018 said that in his words, the anti-Semitic organization had argued that there are checkpoints all across Israel and that Arabs are routinely beaten and killed, and that Palestinians are living in concentration camps similar to those set up by the Nazis in World War II. They say that the Swedish kids they tell Swedish kids that the Jews who control the United States and the media, as well as the banks, and the Palestinian provocateurs are described as peace activists, but they actually do nothing to promote peace. In fact, the opposite. And yet, have to end up with this, despite their terrible anti-Semitic remarks, the Swedish foreign minister, Margot Wallström, met with them during a visit to Ramallah in December 2016. Have you ever come across this Youth Against Settlements and the Swedish kids in places like Hebron?
Yes, we have come across them. They are occasionally present on the streets of Hebron. More prevalent is a group called EAPPI, which is a lot of Swedish young people, Scandinavian Swedish in particular, who have taken it upon themselves to patrol the streets of Hebron. And while they hold themselves out to be observer types, they really spend their time trying to intimidate and demonize Israeli soldiers who are on guard protecting Jewish residents and Arab residents of Hebron.
Yeah, actually, Tobias Pettersson, who is a spokesperson and political researcher for the Swedish pro-Israel NGO Perspective on Israel, wrote a piece called How Sweden Supports Terror Against Israel. And he wrote that Sweden supports Palestinian projects and NGOs promoting terrorism and violence, I'm quoting here. By doing so, Sweden is in fact guilty of encouraging violence and extremism in the Palestinian society. The Swedish aid is not peaceful, and we need to protest how it's been misused. And he quoted also EAPPI, which you talked about, Douglas, and it's one of the, what I would call replacement theology churches and theologies together with the Church of Sweden, which received over $600,000, which they used for a lot of anti-Israel propaganda and activism. What other sort of anti-Israel activism have you found anywhere in the West Bank or Gaza by being involved with Inter-Tzu?
Well, it's fairly widespread. I just want to go back before I address that to a point that you made about the YAS students coming to schools in Switzerland. What they are expressing, Sweden. What they are expressing is classic, right out of the protocols of the Elders of Zion type of anti-Semitism. Jews controlling everything, the banks, the media, the governments. And just imagine if we were to send some of our volunteer activists to schools in Sweden and said, you know, the Palestinians are using the blood of Jewish children to make pita breads, you know, in their ovens. I mean, we would be ridden out of town, out of the country on a rail. We'd be thrown out. We'd never be allowed back in. We'd be taken to the ICC for charges of Islamophobia. There's no attempt at fairness here. There's no attempt at impartiality here. There's no attempt at actually advancing the cause of peace, because peace means somehow bridging gaps and bringing people together. None of this is consistent with an attempt to find common. As far as on in Judea and the West, Judea and Samaria on the West Bank, there are organizations that regularly are filming IDF soldiers who are manning various checkpoints to make sure that terrorists are not getting into Israel. They are harassing IDF soldiers at checkpoints. There was a terrible situation some months ago where representatives from an organization called Maxim Watch were literally screaming at an IDF soldier at one of these checkpoints. And minutes later, he was attacked by an Arab terrorist and killed. And, you know, the question really was whether he was so rattled by the screaming of this NGO that made him vulnerable to such an attack. But this happens a lot. I tell you, one of the things that we are trying to do now about it very successfully is to film those who are filming the soldiers. We're filming the filmers, and to show the world what exactly is going on with these organizations, how they are operating with complete impunity in areas like Hebron and in the West Bank. We recently did one video showing EAPPI volunteers in Hebron, and it went viral. Something like 70,000 people have watched it in a very short period of time. People are interested in this. People want to know the truth.
We are now in Hebron, and we came across these members of the EAPPI, the Ecumenical Accompaniment Program in Palestine and Israel. Now, for those who are not familiar with this organization, this is an organization funded by foreign governments like Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and others, who come to Israel in order to harass Jews and IDF soldiers. Its members come into the country using tourist visas under the guise of being innocent tourists who just want to come on vacation. But in reality, what they do is they come to the country to harass Jewish citizens, to harass IDF soldiers, to create provocation, and then they promote rhetoric that includes accusing Israel of being an apartheid state, of accusing IDF soldiers of committing war crimes, of supporting the Palestinian Arab right of return, meaning what they want to do is essentially turn the only Jewish state in the world into another Arab state. Now, when we first came to Hebron, these people were walking around like they owned the place. They were walking around like they were the sheriffs of the city. No one could talk to them, no one could bother them. But then we started to film them. We started to expose exactly what they're doing. And now look at them. They're cowering away with their backs turned. They don't want anyone to see their faces. And that's because all they want to do is to come to Israel, to harass IDF soldiers, to provoke residents. And they don't want anyone to know they're actually doing it. So it's important to share this video, share it so everyone could see these people and who they are. So next time they're at a bar, whether it be at Tel Aviv or in Jerusalem or Brussels or New York, having a laugh at the expense of the state of Israel, people will know who they are. And again, the EAPPI has a tremendous budget because they're financed by a large number of foreign governments. So please make a contribution. We're Im Tirtzu, we're Israel's largest grassroots Zionist movement, and please make a contribution so we can continue this project, so we can continue sending people to Hebron and to places throughout the country to make sure that these people, that all these anti-Israel activists are held accountable.